In the sleek conference rooms of Boulder's tech corridor, a seasoned software architect was about to face the ultimate betrayal. What started as a routine Monday morning meeting took a shocking turn when they came face to face with corporate restructuring disguised as opportunity. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical disposable employee. For 15 years, she had spent her life building Pinnacle Systems core architecture from the ground up, known for her methodical precision and unwavering dedication to system integrity. When she encountered 3 eager replacement developers, ready to absorb her knowledge, she had no idea they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap of her own making. Sarah chose a path of calculated revenge that would lead to catastrophic system failures across dozens of small businesses. What began as a humiliating demotion would become a masterclass in the hidden power of institutional knowledge. The Colorado Tech Hub would never be the same after one woman's decision to weaponize 15 years of expertise against those who dared to discard her. When corporations treat experience as expendable, sometimes the most dangerous response comes from the very expertise they're trying to replace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell's coffee was still steaming when Jennifer Walsh appeared at her cubicle entrance, her expression carefully neutral in that particular way that meant trouble. "Sarah, could you join David and me in conference room A? We have something exciting to discuss with you." Exciting. Sarah had been at Pinnacle Systems long enough to know that when management used words like exciting on a Monday morning, someone was about to get screwed. She saved her work, 15 years of habit making her protect every line of code she'd written, and followed Jennifer down the hallway. The conference room overlooked Boulder's iconic flatirons, their red sandstone, faces catching the morning light. Sarah had sat through countless meetings in this room, watching the mountains change with the seasons while discussing architecture decisions that would shape Pinnacle's future. She'd always found the view calming. Today, it felt like a judge, looking down on her. David Thornton was already seated at the head of the table, his Harvard MBA confidence filling the space like expensive cologne. Sarah had only met him once before, during the company-wide introduction 3 months ago, where he'd spoken about disrupting legacy thinking and optimizing human capital. She'd recognized him immediately as the type of executive who saw people as line items on a spreadsheet. "Sarah, please, sit." David's smile was practiced, the kind that never reached his eyes. "I hope you don't mind me getting straight to the point. Time is money, as they say." Jennifer settled into the chair beside David, her hands fidgeting with a manila folder. In all their years working together, Sarah had never seen Jennifer avoid eye contact. The realization hit her like cold water. "We've been doing some strategic analysis of our technical architecture," David continued, his voice carrying that particular rhythm of someone who'd given this speech before. "And frankly, Sarah, your expertise is exactly what this company needs to move forward." Sarah's fingers found the edge of the table. 15 years of building Pinnacle's core systems from the ground up had taught her to read between the lines of corporate speak. When executives started complimenting your expertise, they were usually about to take it away from you. "We're implementing an exciting restructuring initiative," David said, his hands gesturing as if he were conducting an orchestra. "A mentorship program that will position you as our senior technical consultant while we bring in fresh talent to handle day-to-day development tasks." The words hit her like physical blows. Senior technical consultant, fresh talent, day-to-day development tasks. Each phrase was carefully chosen to disguise what was really happening. "You'll be training 3 new developers," Jennifer finally spoke, her voice smaller than usual. "They're highly qualified candidates who will be taking over the core architecture responsibilities. Your role will be to ensure they understand our systems before transitioning to your new advisory position." Sarah's mind was already calculating. 3 replacements for her one position. Younger, cheaper, probably temporary contractors they could discard when the next restructuring initiative came around. The math was brutally simple. "How long do I have for this transition?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. 6 weeks, David said, as if he were announcing a generous vacation package. "I know it's aggressive, but we believe in your ability to transfer knowledge efficiently. Think of it as the ultimate legacy project." Legacy project, Sarah almost laughed at the audacity. 15 years of 60-hour weeks, of learning every quirk of their financial management software, of building systems that had never failed their clients. And now they wanted her to package that knowledge into a 6-week training program before being shuffled off to whatever meaningless advisory role they'd invent to avoid paying severance. "The new team members will be starting next Monday," Jennifer added, finally meeting Sarah's eyes. "Marcus Chen from MIT, Lisa Park from Portland State, and Robert Kim from Stanford. All highly recommended." All young, Sarah thought, all desperate to prove themselves, all willing to work for half her salary. "I understand this is a lot to process," David said, his tone suggesting the meeting was already over in his mind. "But I'm confident you'll see the opportunity here. Your institutional knowledge is invaluable, and this new structure allows us to leverage that expertise across a broader technical team." Leverage, another word that meant exploit in corporate speak. Sarah stood slowly, her legs steadier than she'd expected. "When do you need my answer?" David's eyebrows raised slightly, as if the question surprised him. "Well, Sarah, this isn't really a negotiation. The restructuring is already approved. We're simply informing you of your new role in it." The mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the Harvard MBA who'd made his reputation gutting companies and calling it innovation. Sarah saw him clearly now, a man who'd never written a line of code or stayed up all night debugging a critical system, making decisions about people whose work he couldn't even comprehend. "Of course," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to maintain professional courtesy. "I appreciate you thinking of me for this opportunity." Jennifer's relief was visible, but David was already checking his phone, his attention moving to whatever strategic initiative was next on his agenda. "Excellent. Jennifer will handle the logistics. And Sarah?" David looked up from his phone. "I'm really looking forward to seeing what this new structure can accomplish. Fresh perspectives, you know? Sometimes that's exactly what legacy systems need." Sarah nodded, shook David's hand with the appropriate firmness, and walked out of the conference room with her spine straight and her face composed. She even managed a small smile for Jennifer, who was still gathering her papers with nervous energy. But as she walked back to her cubicle, past the open concept workspace where she'd spent the last 15 years of her life, Sarah's mind was already working on a different kind of problem. David Thornton wanted fresh perspectives. He wanted to leverage her institutional knowledge. She'd give him exactly what he asked for. The Flatirons stared down at Boulder through the office windows, ancient and patient. They'd watched the city grow from a small college town to a tech hub, had seen countless companies rise and fall. They'd seen people come and go, but they'd never seen anything quite like what Sarah Mitchell was about to do. Sarah's weekend had been spent in careful preparation. While Amy worked on her environmental science project at the kitchen table, Sarah sat with her laptop, researching methodologies that had been cutting edge in 2010, but were now considered outdated or inefficient. She bookmarked articles about waterfall development processes, monolithic architecture patterns, and database designs that prioritize theoretical elegance over practical performance. "Mom, you're making that face again," Amy said without looking, up from her notes about carbon sequestration. "What face?" "The one you make when you're solving a really complex problem, like when you figured out why the Patterson account kept crashing their month-end reports." Sarah closed her laptop. At 16, Amy had inherited her mother's analytical mind, but combined it with an idealism that Sarah sometimes envied. Just preparing for the new team members. The ones replacing you? The bluntness of teenagers could be brutal. The ones I'm training. Amy finally looked up, her dark eyes serious. You know, in my AP government class, we're studying labor movements. Did you know that companies used to make older workers train their younger replacements during the Industrial Revolution? It was considered particularly cruel because… Amy, I'm just saying, maybe you should talk to a lawyer, or at least update your LinkedIn. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Boulder feel like the center of the universe. Sarah arrived early, as she always did, and spent an hour reviewing the training materials she'd prepared. Each document looked professional, comprehensive, and authoritative. They also contained enough subtle misdirection to ensure that anyone following them would build systems that appeared functional, but would fail under real-world pressure. At 9 o'clock sharp, Jennifer appeared with 3 young faces in tow. Marcus Chen was exactly what Sarah had expected from his resume. MIT confidence tempered by genuine curiosity. He was tall, well-dressed in the casual way that suggested careful thought, and when he shook her hand, his grip was firm without being aggressive. Ms. Mitchell, I've heard incredible things about the systems you've built here, he said, and Sarah could hear real admiration in his voice. I've been reading through some of the architecture documentation, and the way you handled the multi-tenant data isolation is brilliant. The compliment hit harder than Sarah had expected. When was the last time David Thornton had understood her work well enough to appreciate its complexity? Lisa Park was quieter, observing the office space with the same careful attention Sarah had noticed in her own early career. She was small, precise in her movements, and when she spoke, her voice carried the measured tone of someone who thought before speaking. "Thank you for taking the time to train us," Lisa said. "I know transitioning knowledge like this can't be easy." There was something in her tone, not quite suspicion, but awareness. Sarah made a mental note to be careful around Lisa Park. Robert Kim bounded forward with the kind of energy that made Sarah feel exhausted just watching him. His handshake was too firm, his smile too wide, and his first question was about the timeline for taking on real responsibilities. "I've been following Pinnacle's growth trajectory," he said, pulling out his phone to show her a graph he'd apparently created. "The scalability challenges you're facing are exactly the kind of problems I specialized in at Stanford. I'm excited to bring some fresh approaches to your legacy systems." Legacy systems. Sarah's smile didn't waver, but she filed away Robert's casual dismissal of 15 years of work. Jennifer hovered nearby, clearly wanting to escape the awkwardness of the situation. "I'll leave you all to get acquainted. Sarah, you have conference room B reserved for the rest of the week." The conference room was smaller than the one where Sarah had received her death sentence, but it had the same view of the Flatirons. She arranged her materials while the 3 replacements settled into chairs, each bringing their own energy to the space. Marcus had a leather portfolio and took careful notes by hand. Lisa opened a tablet and stylus. Robert had 2 laptops and immediately began connecting them to the room's display system. "Before we dive into the technical details," Sarah began, "I want to understand what you're hoping to learn. Marcus, what's your background with financial software?" "Mostly academic projects and 1 internship at a fintech startup," Marcus admitted. "But I've been studying Pinnacle's approach to compliance reporting, and I'm fascinated by how you've balanced performance with regulatory requirements." Honest, respectful. Sarah felt the first crack in her resolve. "Lisa? I worked on customer management systems at my last job, but nothing at this scale. I'm particularly interested in how you handle data migration and version control across client instances." Thoughtful questions that demonstrated real understanding. Sarah's plan suddenly felt more complicated. "Robert, I'm ready to modernize everything," Robert said with the confidence of someone who'd never had to maintain a system through a regulatory audit. "I've been analyzing your current architecture, And there are obvious opportunities for containerization, microservices migration, and AI-enhanced data processing. I'm thinking we could probably reduce your code base by 60% while improving performance. Sarah's resolve snapped back into place like a rubber band. That's ambitious. Let's start with understanding what we have before we talk about what we might change. She began with the database schema, presenting it as a masterpiece of normalized design. In reality, it was over-normalized to the point of inefficiency, requiring complex joins that would slow down queries as data volume increased. But she described each table relationship with such authority that Marcus took detailed notes while Robert nodded along, clearly impressed by the theoretical elegance. The beauty of this approach, Sarah explained, is that it maintains perfect data integrity. Yes, queries might take a few milliseconds longer, but in financial software, accuracy is always more important than speed. What about indexing strategies? Lisa asked, and Sarah noticed she was sketching the table relationships rather than just taking notes. Great question. We use a conservative indexing approach to avoid the overhead of maintaining too many indexes. It's better to have clean, simple indexes than to over-optimize and create maintenance nightmares. It was a half-truth. Conservative. Indexing was fine for small datasets, but Pinnacle's clients were growing rapidly. The indexing strategy Sarah was teaching would work perfectly until it didn't, and when it failed, it would fail catastrophically during high-traffic periods. Marcus raised his hand like he was still in college. I've read about some newer approaches to indexing that might be relevant here. The key thing to remember, Sarah interrupted gently, is that newer isn't always better. These systems have been running reliably for years. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the one that doesn't break. She could see Marcus processing this, his MIT training conflicting with her voice of experience. Experience won, as she'd known it would. They broke for lunch at a small cafe in downtown Boulder, surrounded by the casual luxury of a tech hub, where 20-somethings discussed startup valuations over $15 salads. Sarah watched her, 3 replacements interact, noting the group dynamics that were already forming. Marcus was clearly the technical leader, asking thoughtful questions and synthesizing information quickly. Robert was the ambitious one, already talking about the systems he'd build once he understood the current constraints. Lisa was the observer, listening more than speaking but missing nothing. So what's David Thornton really like? Robert asked as they waited for their orders. I've heard he's got some aggressive growth plans for the tech side. Sarah sipped her coffee, choosing her words carefully. David's very focused on efficiency and modernization. He sees opportunities where others might see working systems. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear, Robert said. Sometimes you need someone from outside to see the real potential. Marcus looked less certain. But there's value in stability too, right? I mean, these are financial systems. People's businesses depend on them working correctly. Of course, Sarah agreed. That's why this transition period is so important. We need to make sure nothing breaks while we're improving things. Lisa had been quiet, but now she looked directly at Sarah. How do you feel about training? Your replacements? I mean, honestly, it must be strange to be documenting 15 years of work for other people to take over. The question hung in the air. Sarah could feel both Marcus and Robert watching her, suddenly aware of the awkwardness they'd been ignoring. It's an opportunity, Sarah said finally, to make sure the systems I've built continue to serve the company well, to ensure that all the lessons I've learned aren't lost. It wasn't entirely a lie. The lessons would definitely not be lost. They'd be passed on in a very specific way. I think that's really generous, Marcus said quietly. Not everyone would handle this with such professionalism. Sarah smiled, and for a moment, she almost felt guilty about what she was planning. Almost. That evening, Amy found her mother in the home office, surrounded by printouts and technical diagrams. How were the replacements? Amy asked, settling into the chair they'd salvaged from Sarah's first apartment. Smart, eager, young. Are you going to sabotage them? Sarah's hands stilled on her keyboard. What? I'm not stupid, Mom. You've been researching outdated programming practices all weekend. You've got that look you get when you're planning something complicated. And let's be honest, if someone did to me what they're doing to you, I'd want revenge too. For 16 years, Sarah had been the parent, the teacher, the moral authority. But sitting in their small home office with the Rocky Mountains visible through the window, she felt like the child being called out by a wiser adult. It's not that simple, Amy. It never is. But here's what I learned in AP government. When people abuse power, sometimes the only way to show them the consequences is to let their actions play out completely. Just make sure innocent people don't get hurt. Sarah looked at her daughter. Really. Looked at her. When had Amy become so perceptive? When had she developed the kind of wisdom that saw through complicated moral situations with such clarity? What if I told you I was planning to teach them just enough wrong information to make them fail? Amy was quiet for a long moment. I'd say that depends on who gets hurt when they fail. If it's just David Thornton learning that experience matters, maybe that's justice. If it's some small business owner whose payroll gets screwed up because their software doesn't work. She shrugged. That's just passing the hurt down to someone who doesn't deserve it. Sarah saved her work and closed the laptop. Tomorrow, she'd continue building her trap. But tonight, she had some thinking to do about who would ultimately fall into it. The Flatirons stood silent in the darkness outside their window. Ancient sentinels that had watched human ambition and folly play out for millennia. They offered no judgment, no guidance. They simply waited to see what Sarah Mitchell would choose to do with the knowledge that could either build something lasting or tear it all down. The morning sun cast long shadows across conference room B as Sarah arranged her materials for the first formal training session. She'd spent the previous evening refining her approach, balancing the need for subtlety with the satisfaction of her growing plan. The 3 laptops she'd prepared contained carefully crafted examples that would demonstrate exactly the wrong way to solve common problems, while appearing to showcase best practices. Marcus arrived first, carrying the same leather portfolio, and a coffee that smelled expensive. Good morning, Ms. Mitchell. I was wondering, would it be possible to get access to the development environment today? I'd love to start experimenting with some of the concepts we'll be covering. Call me Sarah, please. And absolutely, hands-on learning is always the best approach. She handed him a sheet with login credentials. Though I should warn you, our development environment is a bit particular. We've customized it extensively over the years. What she didn't mention was that the development environment she was giving them access to was deliberately configured with compiler settings that would mask performance issues and encourage inefficient coding practices. The warnings were turned off for several categories of problems that would cause issues in production but wouldn't be visible during development. Lisa entered quietly, her tablet already open to notes from their previous conversations. Thank you for setting this up, she said, gesturing to the room. I've been thinking about some of the database design principles you mentioned yesterday, and I have a few questions. Questions? Sarah had expected this from Lisa. I'm looking forward to them. Understanding the reasoning behind architectural decisions is just as important as understanding the decisions themselves. Robert burst in with his usual energy, wheeling a chair that had clearly been appropriated from someone else's desk. Ready to dive deep into the legacy systems, he announced, powering up both of his laptops simultaneously. I've been reading about some cutting-edge approaches to financial data processing that might be relevant here. That's enthusiasm, Sarah said carefully. Though I've found that in financial software, cutting-edge often means untested in ways that could cost clients money. We'll definitely explore modern approaches, but always through the lens of reliability. She began with coding standards, projecting a style guide that looked comprehensive and professional. In reality, it was a masterpiece of subtle sabotage. The naming conventions were inconsistent enough to make code difficult to maintain. The commenting standards encouraged verbose descriptions of obvious functionality, while discouraging documentation of complex business logic. The error handling guidelines promoted catching exceptions too broadly, masking problems rather than addressing them. The key principle here, Sarah explained, walking through examples on the projection screen, is defensive programming. We assume that anything that can go wrong will go wrong, so we build in layers of protection. She showed them a function that checked for null values 17 different ways before performing a simple calculation. It was impressively thorough and completely unnecessary, the kind of code that looked bulletproof but would slow down every operation and make debugging nearly impossible. Marcus raised his hand. This seems very comprehensive. But wouldn't some of these checks be redundant if we're validating data at the input level? Great question. You'd think so, but in practice, we've found that data has a way of becoming corrupted between input and processing. It's better to be safe than sorry. Sarah watched Marcus process this, his MIT training warring with her voice of experience. She could see him deciding to trust the veteran over his textbook knowledge. Robert was nodding enthusiastically. I love how thorough this is. It's like building a fortress around every piece of data. Perfect. Robert's overconfidence would make him embrace the most problematic practices without question. Lisa was taking careful notes, but Sarah caught her sketching alternative approaches in the margins. This one would bear watching. Let's move on to database interaction patterns, Sarah continued, pulling up the next set of examples. These are some of the techniques that have served us well over the years. She demonstrated how to construct database queries using string concatenation rather than parameterized statements, explaining it as a way to maintain full control over the SQL generation process. She showed them how to perform multiple small queries instead of efficient joins, describing it as maintaining clear separation of concerns. This approach ensures that each piece of data retrieval is independent and testable, she explained, running examples that produced correct results but would scale terribly. Performance might seem slower in development, but remember, these systems are designed for reliability, not speed. Marcus looked puzzled. But wouldn't parameterized queries be more secure? I thought string concatenation was vulnerable to injection attacks. Sarah had prepared for this. In academic environments, yes, parameterized queries are often taught as best practice. But in real production systems, you need the flexibility to dynamically optimize queries based on runtime conditions. Our data validation layers handle injection, prevention at multiple levels so we can afford to prioritize flexibility. She projected a diagram showing their supposed multi-layer validation system that existed mostly in her imagination. Marcus nodded slowly, clearly trying to reconcile this with his computer science education. The important thing to remember, Sarah continued, is that security through obscurity is often more effective than security through standardization. When everyone uses the same patterns, attackers know exactly what to look for. Robert was practically bouncing in his chair. That's brilliant. Custom approaches that attackers won't expect. Lisa's stylus had stopped moving. She was staring at the projection screen with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. They broke for lunch, and Sarah watched the three of them head out together. Through the conference room window, she could see them walking toward the downtown area, already forming the kind of working relationships that would define their collaboration. Frank Rodriguez appeared in the doorway as she was cleaning up her materials. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Interesting session, he said, leaning against the door frame with his characteristic casual observation. "I was walking by and caught some of your database examples." Sarah's hands stilled on her laptop. Frank had been at Pinnacle longer than anyone except her. His Air Force background had given him a particular appreciation for systems that worked under pressure, and his 12 years in IT support meant he'd seen every possible way that code could fail. "Just covering the fundamentals," she said carefully. Frank's expression was neutral, but Sarah knew him well enough to recognize the thoughtful pause that meant he was processing something unexpected. Some of those query patterns looked familiar. Weren't those the approaches we moved away from a few years back when we were having those performance issues with the Morrison Industries account? The Morrison Industries account. Sarah remembered. A client whose rapid growth had exposed every inefficiency in their original database design. They'd spent months optimizing queries and rebuilding indexes to handle the increased load. "Different context," Sarah said. "These examples are simplified for training purposes." "Sure." Frank nodded slowly. "Just seemed like an interesting choice, given that we documented why those patterns didn't scale well, but I'm sure you know what you're doing." He left without another word, but Sarah could feel the weight of his observation. Frank wasn't suspicious, not yet, but he was paying attention. She'd need to be more careful about which examples she used, especially when demonstrating concepts that Frank had personally seen fail in production. When the team returned from lunch, Sarah shifted to system architecture principles. This was where she could do the most damage with the least obvious deception. She presented monolithic architecture as proven and reliable, describing microservices as overly complex for most business needs. She explained tight coupling as ensuring system coherence and warned against the dangers of premature optimization. "The beauty of monolithic design," she said, projecting a diagram of a system where every component depended on every other component, "is that everything is in one place. You never have to worry about network latency, service discovery, or distributed debugging." Marcus was taking notes, but she could see the conflict in his expression. "But what about scalability? If one component needs more resources, don't you have to scale the entire system?" "In theory, yes, but in practice, proper resource planning eliminates most scaling concerns. It's better to have one robust system than a dozen fragile ones that might fail independently." She could see him wrestling with this, his education telling him one thing while her experience suggested another. The seed of doubt she was planting would grow over time, making him second-guess his instincts when faced with architectural decisions. Robert was already converted. "This makes so much sense. Keep it simple. Keep it working. Why complicate things with distributed systems when you don't have to?" Lisa had been quiet for most of the afternoon, but now she spoke up. "What about the client isolation requirements? How do you handle security boundaries in a monolithic system when different tenants have different compliance needs?" The question was sharp, technical, and exactly the kind of challenge that would expose the weaknesses in what Sarah was teaching. She deflected smoothly. "Excellent question, and one that gets to the heart of why our approach has been so successful. Rather than relying on service boundaries for isolation, we implement it at the database level through careful schema design and access control. It's more secure because there are fewer moving parts to compromise." It sounded authoritative, but Lisa's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Sarah made another mental note to watch this one carefully. As the day wound down, Sarah assigned their first practical exercise: implement a simple user authentication system using the principles they'd covered. She provided skeleton code that looked professional, but contained every bad practice she'd demonstrated. "Take your time with this," she said, as they packed up their materials. "Focus on following the patterns we've discussed, rather than trying to be clever. Remember, in production systems, Boring and reliable beats innovative and risky every time. Marcus lingered as the others left. Sarah, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to do this properly. I know this transition must be difficult, but you're being incredibly generous with your knowledge. The genuine gratitude in his voice hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. For a moment, she saw herself through his eyes, an experienced professional sharing hard-won wisdom with the next generation. It was how she'd always imagined her career would evolve, mentoring younger developers and ensuring that her knowledge lived on. Just remember what we've covered, she said finally. These systems serve real businesses with real people depending on them. Whatever you build needs to work, even if it's not perfect. That night, Sarah sat in her home office reviewing the day's materials. Amy appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, settling into her usual chair. How was day 1 of Operation Sabotage? Amy asked with the bluntness that only teenagers could manage. Sarah accepted the tea gratefully. Complicated. One of them, Marcus, is genuinely likable and talented. This would be easier if they were all arrogant jerks. Are you having second thoughts? Sarah considered the question seriously. About the plan? No. About who gets hurt by it. Maybe. Amy was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkening mountains. In my environmental science class, we're studying tipping points, how ecosystems can absorb stress for a long time, but then suddenly collapse when they reach a critical threshold, very relevant to corporate structures. The question is whether you're trying to prevent a collapse or cause one. Sarah sipped her tea, thinking about Marcus's earnest questions, Lisa's perceptive observations, and Robert's dangerous overconfidence. She thought about David Thornton's casual dismissal of 15 years of expertise and Jennifer's inability to meet her eyes during that awful meeting. I'm trying to make sure the right people learn the right lessons, she said finally. Amy nodded. Just make sure you know which people those are. Outside their window, Boulder settled into evening quiet, the tech workers heading home to their expensive apartments and their startup dreams. The Flatirons stood patient and eternal, watching another day pass in the endless cycle of human ambition and consequence. Sarah opened her laptop and began preparing materials for day 2. The authentication examples she'd give them tomorrow would look elegant and secure, but would store passwords in easily reversible formats and implement session management that could be compromised by anyone who understood how it really worked. The trap was being built carefully, piece by piece. Soon enough, they'd all find out who would fall into it. 3 weeks into the training program, the first signs of Sarah's sabotage began to manifest in ways that made her stomach clench with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. She stood in the back of Conference Room A, watching Marcus and Robert present their joint project to a small audience of Pinnacle employees, including 2 representatives from their client, Hartwell and Associates. The project was supposed to be simple, a client dashboard that would display financial summaries using the authentication and database patterns Sarah had taught them. Marcus had built the back end using her recommended monolithic architecture, while Robert had implemented the front end following her defensive programming guidelines. As you can see, Marcus said, clicking through the demo with the careful precision Sarah had come to expect from him, the system provides comprehensive financial reporting with full audit trails and security validation. The dashboard loaded, slowly, much more slowly than Sarah's systems typically performed, but it loaded correctly. The data was accurate, the formatting was clean, and the security appeared robust. Robert stepped forward to explain the technical implementation, his confidence radiating through the room. We've implemented 17 layers of data validation, he said proudly, ensuring that no corrupted information can possibly reach the reporting engine. Every query is dynamically optimized at runtime, and we've built in comprehensive error handling that captures and logs every possible exception. Sarah watched the Hartwell representatives nod approvingly. They were business people, not technicians. To them, the system looked professional and functional. They couldn't see the inefficient database queries running underneath, or the exponential performance degradation that would occur as their data volume increased. "Let's try a stress test," suggested Jennifer, who had been watching from the side of the room. "Can you show us how it handles a larger dataset?" Sarah's pulse quickened. Marcus looked uncertain for the first time since the presentation began. "We've been testing with the standard development data," he said carefully, "but we can certainly try it with a larger sample." Robert, with his characteristic overconfidence, immediately began typing. "I'll just modify the query parameters to pull 6 months of data instead of 1 month. Should be no problem." The system began processing the request, and processing, and processing. After 30 seconds, the client representatives began shifting uncomfortably. After a minute, Jennifer's expression changed from encouraging to concerned. After 90 seconds, the system threw a timeout error and displayed a stack trace that Robert clearly didn't understand. "Ah," Robert said, his confidence finally wavering. "That's unexpected. Must be a configuration issue with the development environment." Marcus was already pulling up logs on his laptop, his face pale as he scrolled through error messages. Sarah could see him processing what he was seeing. The query patterns she'd taught him were generating dozens of unnecessary database calls, each one inefficient enough to be manageable individually, but catastrophic when combined. "We can definitely resolve this," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the obvious panic in his eyes. "It's just a matter of optimizing the query structure." One of the Hartwell representatives, a woman in her 50s who'd introduced herself as their CFO, spoke up quietly. "How long would that optimization take? We were hoping to have this system handling our month-end reporting by next week." Sarah watched Jennifer's face cycle through several emotions as she realized that the training program she'd championed was producing systems that couldn't handle real-world loads. "We'll have this resolved within 24 hours, Jennifer said with the forced confidence of a manager trying to control a situation spinning out of her grasp. "Marcus, Robert, let's reconvene tomorrow morning with a performance analysis." As the room cleared, Sarah lingered, ostensibly to help clean up the projection equipment. She could hear Marcus and Robert in the hallway, their voices carrying the kind of urgent technical discussion that happens when engineers realize they've built something fundamentally broken. "I don't understand," Marcus was saying. "The individual queries all work fine. It's only when we scale up that the performance degrades." "Maybe it's the validation layers," Robert suggested. 17 might be excessive for larger data sets. Sarah almost smiled. They were so close to understanding the problem, but they were approaching it with the assumption that her training had been correct. They were looking for implementation errors rather than design flaws. Frank Rodriguez appeared in the doorway as Sarah was wrapping up cables. "Interesting demo," he said with his characteristic understatement. "Growing pains," Sarah replied carefully. "It's always challenging when you're learning new patterns." Frank nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't buying her. Casual dismissal. "You know, I was looking at some of the code samples you've been using in training. The query structures reminded me of some approaches we tried back in our wait, before we learned they didn't scale well." Sarah's hands stilled on the cable she was coiling. "Different context," she said, echoing her previous deflection. "Maybe. But I'm wondering if we should bring Lisa in on the debugging session tomorrow. She's been doing some interesting research into database optimization patterns. Might have some fresh perspectives." "Lisa." Sarah had been watching her carefully over the past 3 weeks, noting how she asked thoughtful questions and took notes that went beyond what was being taught. More concerning, Lisa had started staying late to experiment with alternative approaches to the patterns Sarah was demonstrating. "That's a good idea," Sarah said, knowing she couldn't object without raising suspicions. Fresh eyes always help with debugging. Frank left, but Sarah could feel the weight of his observation. He wasn't openly suspicious yet, but he was paying attention in a way that could become problematic. That afternoon, Lisa appeared at Sarah's cubicle with a printed stack of papers and an expression that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes? I've been researching some of the patterns we've been learning, and I found some conflicting information online." Sarah gestured to the empty chair beside her desk, her mind already racing through possible responses. "Of course. What kind of conflicting information?" Lisa opened her folder, revealing printouts from various technical blogs and documentation sites. "Well, for example, the database query patterns you showed us. I found several articles that describe string concatenation as a security vulnerability, and most current best practices recommend parameterized queries." Sarah had prepared for this conversation, but Lisa's careful preparation made it more challenging than she'd expected. "Those articles are written for general audiences," Sarah said smoothly. "They don't account for the specific security measures we have in place here at Pinnacle. Our data validation layers handle injection prevention at multiple levels, so we can afford to prioritize flexibility." Lisa nodded, but Sarah could see her processing this explanation with visible skepticism. "What about the performance implications? I ran some tests comparing the approaches, and the parameterized queries were consistently faster." This was dangerous territory. Lisa wasn't just asking questions. She was conducting independent research that could expose the flaws in Sarah's training. "Performance in isolated tests doesn't always translate to production environments," Sarah said carefully. "Our systems have evolved over 15 years to work optimally with specific patterns. Changing those patterns might improve micro benchmarks, but could introduce unexpected incompatibilities." It was a reasonable-sounding explanation that would discourage experimentation, but Lisa's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I understand," Lisa said slowly. "But what about the authentication system we're building? The password storage mechanism seems unusual. Most sources recommend salted hashing, but our approach uses reversible encryption." Sarah felt a cold spike of alarm. Lisa had identified one of the most dangerous aspects of her sabotage: the deliberately insecure password handling that would create massive compliance violations if implemented in production. "That's a great example of why you can't always trust general advice," Sarah said, buying time while she formulated a response. "Financial software has unique requirements for password recovery and audit compliance. Reversible encryption allows us to support legitimate business needs that hashed passwords can't accommodate." Lisa was taking notes, but her stylus had slowed. "Could you help me understand those specific business requirements? I want to make sure I'm implementing this correctly." The question was a trap, though Sarah wasn't sure if Lisa was setting it intentionally. Any specific business requirements? Sarah invented could be fact-checked, but being vague would increase Lisa's suspicions. "I'll put together some documentation on our compliance requirements," Sarah said finally. "It's complicated enough that it deserves a dedicated training session." Lisa nodded and gathered her papers. "Thank you. I really appreciate how thorough you're being with our training. I know this can't be easy for you." There was something in her tone, not quite sympathy, but an awareness of the awkwardness of the situation that made Sarah wonder how much Lisa actually understood about what was happening. That evening, Sarah found herself walking through downtown Boulder, trying to clear her head before facing Amy's inevitable questions about the day's events. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the houses nestled against the foothills. Students and tech workers filled the outdoor patios of restaurants and breweries, their conversations mixing optimism about startup ventures with complaints about housing costs. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Can you join the debugging session tomorrow? We need to understand what went wrong with the demo." Sarah typed back, "Of course. happy to help troubleshoot. But as she walked past the lit windows of coffee shops where other tech workers hunched over laptops, she found herself thinking about Marcus's expression during the failed demo. The confusion and embarrassment weren't directed at her. He was blaming himself for implementing her teachings incorrectly. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Ms. Mitchell. This is Marcus. I hope it's okay that I got your number from the company directory. I wanted to apologize for the demo today. I clearly didn't understand the patterns well enough to implement them correctly. Could we schedule some time tomorrow to review what I did wrong? I don't want to make the same mistakes again." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Marcus wasn't questioning her training, he was questioning his own competence. The eager MIT graduate who'd started 3 weeks ago with such confidence was now doubting his abilities because the methods she'd taught him were fundamentally flawed. She typed back, "No need to apologize. These things happen when you're learning complex systems. We'll figure it out tomorrow." But as she walked home through the quiet streets of Boulder, with the Flatirons silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Sarah found herself wondering if the satisfaction of revenge was worth the cost of watching genuinely talented people lose confidence in themselves. Amy was waiting in the kitchen when Sarah arrived home, her environmental science textbook open beside a cup of tea that had gone cold. "How was the first casualty?" Amy asked without looking up from her reading. Sarah poured herself a glass of water and sat down across from her daughter. "More complicated than I expected. Let me guess. The people you're hurting aren't the ones who deserve it." The insight was so sharp that Sarah felt exposed. "One of them apologized to me for not being good enough to implement what I taught him correctly." Amy finally looked up, her dark eyes serious. "And how did that make you feel?" "Like maybe this wasn't the clean revenge I thought it would be." Amy closed her textbook and leaned forward. "Mom, can I tell you something I learned in my ethics class? The thing about revenge is that it never stays contained. You think you're targeting one person, but the damage spreads out like ripples in a pond. And usually, the people who get hurt the most are the ones who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Sarah thought about Marcus's text message, about Lisa's careful questions, about Frank's growing suspicions. Amy was right. The ripples were already spreading far beyond David Thornton. "What would you do?" Sarah asked quietly. Amy was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness that made her seem older than her 16 years. "I'd ask myself what I really want. Do I want David Thornton to learn a lesson? Or do I want to prove that I'm better than the way he treated me?" Outside their kitchen window, Boulder slept peacefully, unaware that in a small house overlooking the city, a mother and daughter were discussing the difference between justice and revenge, and whether it was possible to achieve one without sacrificing the other. Sarah's phone rang at 11:30 p.m., jarring her from the restless half-sleep that had become her norm since starting the training program. The caller ID showed her former colleague Jessica Chen, no relation to Marcus, who'd moved to a startup in Austin 2 years ago. "Sarah, I hope I'm not calling too late. I know you're mountain time, but I just got off a call with a potential client who mentioned they'd been talking to Pinnacle Systems, and something they said made me think of you." Sarah padded to the kitchen, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Amy. "What kind of something?" "They said Pinnacle's demo had some performance issues, and they were concerned about the technical direction. But here's the weird part. They specifically mentioned that the problems seemed to come from outdated practices that any experienced developer would know to avoid." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Outdated practices?" "Yeah, like string concatenation for database queries, over-normalized schemas, monolithic architecture patterns. Stuff we moved away from years ago." The client was confused because they'd heard Pinnacle had solid technical leadership. Jessica paused. "Sarah, you're still the lead architect there, right?" "It's complicated. There's been some restructuring. Oh shit, they didn't. Jessica's voice carried the particular concern of someone who'd seen too many talented people pushed out by corporate politics. Sarah, what's going on? Sarah found herself explaining the situation, the demotion disguised as a promotion, the requirement to train her replacements, the 6-week timeline. What she didn't mention was her plan to sabotage the training. That's exactly the kind of bullshit that made me leave corporate tech, Jessica said when Sarah finished. But here's what I don't understand. If you're training these new developers, why are they using practices that you'd never teach? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah could feel the weight of her deception pressing down on her, heavier now that someone outside the situation was pointing out its obvious flaws. Like I said, it's complicated. Sarah. Jessica's voice carried 15 years of friendship and professional respect. Please tell me you're not sabotaging your own training program. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything Sarah couldn't say and everything Jessica was beginning to understand. Jesus, Sarah, I get it, I really do. But if this blows back on you— It won't, Sarah said quickly. I've been careful. Careful doesn't matter if smart people start asking the right questions. And from what you've told me about these replacements, at least one of them sounds smart enough to figure this out. After Jessica hung up, Sarah sat in her darkened kitchen, staring out at the sleeping city below. The conversation had crystallized something she'd been trying to ignore. Her sabotage wasn't as subtle as she'd believed. People were starting to notice, starting to ask questions. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Amy standing in the kitchen doorway until her daughter spoke. Mom, are you okay? Sarah turned, realizing how she must look, sitting alone in the dark, phone in hand, probably radiating the kind of tension that had made Amy such a perceptive reader of adult emotions. Just a work call. Go back to bed, sweetheart. But Amy moved into the kitchen instead, her bare feet silent on the tile floor. At 16, she'd inherited Sarah's analytical mind, but combined it with an emotional intelligence that sometimes made Sarah feel like the child in their relationship. You've been different these past few weeks, Amy said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. Distracted, and you've been getting phone calls late at night. Amy, is it about the people replacing you? Sarah looked at her daughter, really, looked at her. When had Amy become so perceptive? When had she developed the kind of awareness that could see through careful deceptions? What do you know about my work situation? Amy was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see her deciding how much to reveal. I know they're making you train the people who are taking your job. I know you think it's unfair. And I know you've been researching outdated programming practices for weeks. The last observation hit Sarah like cold water. You've been watching my browsing history? I've been watching you, Mom. You've got that look you get when you're solving a really complex problem, but it's different this time. Usually when you're problem solving, you're trying to build something. This time, Amy shrugged. This time, it feels like you're trying to break something. Sarah felt exposed, caught by someone who knew her better than she knew herself. It's not that simple. It never is, but here's what I learned in AP Government about the difference between justice and revenge. Amy leaned forward, her expression serious in the way that made her seem older than her years. Justice is about making things right. Revenge is about making things even. And what if making things right isn't possible? Then you have to decide what kind of person you want to be when it's over. The words hung between them, carrying a weight that made Sarah realize her 16-year-old daughter had developed a moral framework more sophisticated than most adults she knew. What if I told you I was teaching them wrong on purpose? Sarah asked quietly. That I was setting them up to fail, because the people who are doing this to me deserve to learn what happens when they throw away institutional knowledge? Amy considered this for a long moment. I'd ask you who else gets hurt when they fail. If it's just David Thornton learning that experience matters, maybe that's justice. If it's some small business owner whose payroll gets screwed up because their software doesn't work. She shrugged. That's just passing the hurt down to someone who doesn't deserve it. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. Amy had identified the exact moral compromise that Sarah had trying to ignore, that her revenge against David Thornton would inevitably harm innocent people whose only crime was trusting Pinnacle Systems to handle their financial data correctly. What would you do? Sarah asked. I'd ask myself what I really want. Do I want David Thornton to learn a lesson, or do I want to prove that I'm better than the way he treated me? Before Sarah could respond, Amy's expression changed to something like alarm. Mom, someone's coming up the driveway. Sarah turned toward the front window, where headlights were indeed sweeping across their small front yard. At nearly midnight, unexpected visitors meant either emergencies or very bad news. The car door slammed, followed by footsteps on their front porch and a careful knock that suggested whoever was visiting knew it was late and was trying not to wake the neighbors. Sarah opened the door to find Marcus Chen standing on her porch, looking exhausted and carrying a laptop bag that suggested this wasn't a social call. Marcus? What are you doing here? I'm sorry to bother you so late, he said, his usual polite confidence replaced by something that looked like desperation. But I've been debugging the performance issues from today's demo, and I found something that doesn't make sense. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. Come in. Do you want some coffee? Marcus followed her into the kitchen, where Amy was still sitting at the table with her textbook. He looked surprised to see her, clearly not having considered that his late-night visit might be disturbing a family. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. It's fine, Amy said with the casual directness of teenagers. I'm Amy, Sarah's daughter. I was just asking her about work stuff anyway. Sarah shot her daughter a warning look, but Amy's expression was innocently curious. Marcus opened his laptop and began pulling up code samples. I've been tracing through the query patterns you taught us, trying to understand why they perform so poorly with larger datasets. And I found some research papers that suggest these patterns were actually identified as anti-patterns several years ago. He turned the screen toward Sarah, showing academic articles with titles like Performance Implications of Over-Normalized Database Design and The Hidden Costs of Defensive Programming Practices. I'm confused, Marcus continued, his voice carrying genuine bewilderment rather than accusation. These articles describe exactly the problems we're seeing, but they're talking about approaches that we're implementing as best practices. Did something change in the industry that made these patterns obsolete? Sarah stared at the screen, realizing that Marcus had done exactly what she'd hoped he wouldn't do: independent research that exposed the flaws in her training. But his question revealed something she hadn't expected. He was still giving her the benefit of the doubt, assuming there must be some explanation that would preserve his respect for her expertise. Those papers are discussing theoretical scenarios, Sarah said carefully. In practice, our specific environment and client requirements make different trade-offs necessary. Marcus nodded slowly, but Sarah could see him processing this explanation with visible skepticism. Could you help me understand those specific requirements? Because when I try to explain to Robert and Lisa why we're using these patterns, I feel like I'm missing something fundamental. Amy had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with the kind of innocent curiosity that made Sarah's stomach clench. Are you one of the people replacing my mom? Marcus looked startled. Yes. I mean, we're the new development team. Your mother is training us before transitioning to her consulting role. That must be weird, Amy continued with devastating casualness. Learning from someone and knowing you're going to take their job, I'd feel terrible. Amy, Sarah warned, but Marcus was nodding, his expression pained. It is weird, and I do feel terrible. Your mother built these systems from the ground up, and now we're supposed to just Take over. It doesn't seem right. Amy looked directly at Sarah, her meaning unmistakable. No, it doesn't. Marcus closed his laptop, seeming to sense the undercurrents in the conversation that he didn't fully understand. I should go. Thank you for taking the time to look at this, even so late. Marcus, Sarah called as he reached the door. The debugging session tomorrow. Bring these questions. It's good that you're thinking critically about the patterns. After he left, Sarah and Amy sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Amy spoke. He seems nice. He is nice. That's the problem. No, Mom. The problem is that you're about to destroy a nice person's career to get back at someone who isn't nice. Sarah felt the weight of her daughter's judgment, sharper than any criticism from a colleague or supervisor. Amy had seen the situation with the clarity that came from not being invested in the corporate games and professional resentments that had clouded Sarah's perspective. What am I supposed to do? Sarah asked quietly. Let them get away with throwing me away after 15 years? No. But maybe prove you're better than them instead of proving you're as bad as them. Amy stood up, gathering her textbook. I'm going to bed. But Mom? That guy who was just here? He's going to figure out what you're doing. And when he does, he's going to be hurt that someone he respects lied to him. That's going to be worse than any technical failure. Sarah sat alone in her kitchen after Amy went upstairs, staring at the reflection of her face in the dark window. Outside, Boulder slept peacefully, unaware that in a small house overlooking the city, a conversation between a mother and daughter had just changed the trajectory of a carefully planned revenge. She thought about Marcus's expression as he'd shown her the research papers, confused but not accusatory, still giving her the benefit of the doubt, even when the evidence suggested he shouldn't. She thought about his text message apologizing for the failed demo, taking responsibility for implementing her deliberately flawed teachings incorrectly. And she thought about Amy's question. What kind of person did she want to be when this was over? Sarah opened her laptop and began reviewing the materials she'd prepared for tomorrow's debugging session. For the first time in weeks, she found herself considering what it would mean to actually help Marcus, Lisa, and Robert succeed instead of ensuring they failed. The choice was hers. The question was whether she still had the courage to make the right one. The crisis meeting took place in David Thornton's corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Boulder's tech corridor. Sarah had been in this office exactly once before, during the company-wide introduction where David had outlined his vision for optimizing human capital and technological infrastructure. Wait, today, the same space felt like a war room as the consequences of her sabotage cascaded through Pinnacle Systems like a software virus attacking critical infrastructure. Jennifer sat at the polished conference table looking haggard, surrounded by printouts of error reports and client complaint summaries. Marcus and Robert flanked her, their laptops open to code repositories and debugging logs. Lisa had positioned herself slightly apart from the group, her tablet displaying what appeared to be a systematic analysis of system failures. David paced behind his desk, his Harvard MBA composure finally showing cracks as he processed the scope of the crisis that had erupted over the past 48 hours. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, David said, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone trying to maintain authority while watching their strategy collapse. 3 separate client implementations have failed within the same week, all showing similar performance degradation and security vulnerabilities. 4 clients, Jennifer corrected quietly. Henderson Manufacturing just called. Their month-end reporting crashed overnight. Sarah watched from her position near the window, officially present as the senior technical consultant who might provide insights into the failures. In reality, she was witnessing the systematic destruction of systems that bore her architectural DNA, perverted through her deliberately flawed training into something that looked professional, but collapsed under real-world pressure. Marcus spoke up, his voice steady despite the obvious stress etched in his expression. We've identified several patterns in the failures, database timeouts during high-volume queries, memory leaks in the authentication systems, and what appears to be security vulnerabilities in the password management modules. Security vulnerabilities? David's pacing stopped abruptly. What kind of security vulnerabilities? Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The password storage implementation we built follows the patterns Sarah taught us, but when we consulted external documentation, we found some concerning discrepancies. Sarah felt a cold spike of alarm. Robert had been the most eager to accept her teachings without question, but apparently even his overconfidence had limits when faced with obvious security flaws. What kind of discrepancies? David's voice had dropped to the dangerous quiet that executives used when they sensed legal liability. Lisa finally spoke, her quiet voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. The password storage mechanism uses reversible encryption instead of salted hashing. The database query patterns are vulnerable to injection attacks, and the authentication session management stores sensitive data in easily accessible formats. Sarah watched David's face cycle through several expressions as he processed the implications. Financial software with security vulnerabilities wasn't just a technical problem. It was a compliance nightmare that could result in regulatory sanctions and massive legal exposure. How is this possible? David asked, his gaze moving between Jennifer and Sarah. These are basic security principles. Any experienced developer would know better. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Sarah realized this was the moment she'd been unconsciously preparing for, when her sabotage would be exposed and she'd have to face the consequences of her choices. The patterns we implemented follow the training materials exactly, Marcus said carefully. But when we tried to debug the performance issues, we found research suggesting these approaches were problematic. Sarah could hear the diplomatic language Marcus was using to avoid directly criticizing her training while still pointing out its fundamental flaws. Even now, facing system failures and potential security breaches, he was trying to protect her reputation. Lisa has been conducting independent research, Jennifer added, her voice carrying a tension that suggested she was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. Show them what you found. Lisa activated the room's projection system, displaying a meticulously organized analysis that made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition and dread. The presentation was titled Comparative Analysis, Current Implementation versus Industry Best Practices. I started researching when I noticed discrepancies between our training materials and current industry standards, Lisa began, her voice gaining confidence as she moved into technical territory. What I found was concerning enough that I've been documenting everything. She clicked through slides showing side-by-side comparisons of the code patterns Sarah had taught versus recommended practices from authoritative sources. Each comparison was damning, clearly demonstrating that Sarah's training had been deliberately misleading. The database query patterns we're using were identified as anti-patterns in 2019, Lisa continued. The authentication mechanisms violate basic security principles that have been standard since 2015, and the architectural decisions we're implementing have been documented as scaling poorly since 2017. David's expression had shifted from concern to something approaching fury as he realized the implications. Are you telling me that we've been training our new development team using outdated and insecure practices? Not outdated, Lisa said quietly. These weren't practices that became obsolete over time. They were never considered best practices. Most of them were specifically identified as approaches to avoid. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel everyone in the room processing the logical conclusion that Lisa's research pointed toward, that the training had been deliberately sabotaged. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Sarah has 15 years of experience building these systems. There must be context we're missing. Even now, faced with evidence of deliberate misdirection, Marcus was trying to find an explanation that would preserve his respect for Sarah's expertise. The loyalty was touching and made what Sarah had done feel even more reprehensible. What context could possibly justify teaching security vulnerabilities as best practices? David asked, his voice rising. What context makes it acceptable to build systems that fail under normal business loads? Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue the deception, try to deflect blame, and hope that the investigation wouldn't conclusively prove her intentional sabotage. Or she could face the consequences of her choices and try to minimize the damage to people who didn't deserve to be caught in her revenge plot. There's no context, Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. The training materials were deliberately flawed. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Jennifer's face went pale. Marcus looked like he'd been struck. Robert's mouth fell open in obvious shock. Only Lisa seemed unsurprised, as if Sarah's confession confirmed suspicions she'd been harboring for weeks. What did you just say? David's voice was dangerously quiet. Sarah looked directly at him, feeling a strange sense of relief as the weight of deception finally lifted from her shoulders. I said the training materials were deliberately flawed. I taught them incorrect practices, outdated patterns, and insecure implementations. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, David spoke, his voice carrying the cold precision of someone calculating legal exposure and financial damage. Why? Sarah could have explained about the betrayal of being demoted after 15 years of dedicated service. She could have described the indignity of being forced to train cheaper replacements who would inevitably be discarded in the next round of optimization. She could have outlined the particular cruelty of disguising termination as promotion while demanding gratitude for the opportunity. Instead, she simply said, "Because I was angry." Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back to hit the window. All this time, when I was apologizing for not understanding the patterns correctly, when I was questioning my own abilities. His voice carried a pain that cut deeper than any professional consequence Sarah might face. Marcus, I don't. His voice was sharp in a way Sarah had never heard from him. Just don't. Robert was scrolling through his laptop, his expression shifting from shock to something approaching panic. How much of our code is compromised? How many systems do we need to rebuild? All of it, Lisa said quietly. Everything we've built based on the training materials will need to be redesigned from the ground up. Jennifer finally found her voice. Sarah, do you understand what you've done? We have clients running systems with security vulnerabilities. We have compliance obligations that we're now failing to meet. The legal exposure alone. I understand, Sarah said. And I'm prepared to fix it. David's laugh was harsh and humorless. Fix it? Sarah, you've sabotaged months of development work. You've exposed our clients to security risks. You've potentially violated federal regulations governing financial software. This isn't something you can just fix with a code patch. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people whose lives she'd deliberately disrupted in pursuit of her revenge against David Thornton. Marcus, who'd trusted her expertise and was now questioning his own competence. Robert, whose overconfidence had made him an easy target but who didn't deserve to have his career sabotaged. Lisa, who'd been perceptive enough to identify the problems but professional enough to try to address them constructively. Jennifer, who was caught between friendship and corporate survival in a situation that Sarah had created. What do you want me to do? Sarah asked. David's expression was calculating, already moving beyond anger toward damage control. First, you're going to provide us with correct training materials and implementation guidelines. Second, you're going to work with the development team to identify every system that needs to be rebuilt. Third, You're going to do this without compensation while we determine the legal implications of what you've done. Sarah nodded. Agreed. And Sarah? David's voice carried the finality of someone making a decision that would define the rest of the conversation. You're going to do this knowing that your employment here is terminated effective immediately. The only question is whether we're going to file criminal charges for deliberate sabotage. As the meeting broke up and people filed out of the office, Sarah found herself alone with the view of Boulder's tech corridor, where other companies were building systems and pursuing innovations without the weight of betrayal and revenge, poisoning their efforts. She thought about Amy's question from the night before. What kind of person did she want to be when this was over? Now she knew. She wanted to be someone who fixed the damage she'd caused, regardless of the personal cost. The question was whether it was too late to become that person. The Boulder cityscape spread out below Sarah's small office window like a circuit board, its orderly grid of streets punctuated by the chaotic sprawl of tech campuses and startup incubators. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room as Sarah sat reviewing the comprehensive analysis that Lisa had spent the weekend preparing, a document that laid out every flaw in the training program with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a case. Sarah had been expecting this confrontation since the crisis meeting in David's office 3 days ago. What she hadn't expected was the way Lisa had requested it, not through Jennifer or HR, but with a simple email asking if they could discuss some technical questions privately. The professional courtesy felt like salt in a wound Sarah had inflicted on herself. A quiet knock interrupted her brooding. Lisa stood in the doorway, her tablet and a printed folder in hand, her expression unreadable in the careful way that suggested she'd been planning this conversation. "Thank you for staying late," Lisa said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "I wanted to talk without the whole team present." Sarah gestured toward the folder. "I assume that's your analysis of my training materials, among other things." Lisa opened the folder, revealing pages of annotated code samples, performance benchmarks, and security vulnerability assessments. "I've been working on this since the second week of training, when I started noticing inconsistencies." The confession hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. "The second week?" "Some things didn't make sense from the beginning," Lisa said carefully. "Database patterns that seemed inefficient, security practices that contradicted everything I'd learned in school, architectural decisions that felt deliberately problematic. But I kept thinking I must be missing something important." Sarah looked at the young woman across from her, barely 2 years out of college, quiet and unassuming, but apparently perceptive enough to identify deliberate sabotage that had fooled both Marcus and Robert. "What made you finally realize it was intentional?" Lisa turned to a page near the back of her folder, revealing a side-by-side comparison of Sarah's training materials with documentation from Pinnacle's own systems. "I got access to some of the legacy code repositories," Lisa said. "The systems you actually built for Pinnacle use completely different patterns than what you were teaching us. Efficient database queries, proper security implementations, scalable architecture. Everything you taught us was essentially the opposite of how you actually work." The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Sarah had been so focused on creating believable deceptions for the trainees that she'd forgotten they would eventually have access to her real work for comparison. "Why didn't you expose this earlier?" Sarah asked. Lisa was quiet for a moment, her stylus tracing abstract patterns on her tablet screen. "Because I kept hoping I was wrong. And because—" She looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. "Because I understand why you did it." The admission caught Sarah off guard. "You understand. My father worked for a manufacturing company for 28 years, Lisa said quietly. Built their entire quality control system from the ground up. When they decided to modernize, they brought in a consulting firm that recommended replacing him with younger, cheaper engineers. They made him train his replacements for 6 months before they let him go. Sarah felt a recognition that cut deeper than any professional criticism. What happened to him? He couldn't find another job. 55 years old, supposedly obsolete. Overnight. He ended up driving for a delivery service until he could retire early and take reduced Social Security. Lisa's voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the controlled anger underneath. He never got over the betrayal. The bitterness ate at him for years. The parallel was uncomfortable and exact. Sarah could see herself in Lisa's father, the experienced professional discarded by people who didn't understand the value of institutional knowledge, forced to train cheaper replacements who would inevitably struggle without the deep understanding that came from years of hands-on experience. "So you understand the impulse for revenge," Sarah said. "I understand the impulse. What I don't understand is the execution." Lisa flipped to another section of her analysis. "You're not hurting David Thornton with this sabotage. He doesn't understand the technical details well enough to be affected by system failures. You're hurting Marcus, who genuinely respects you. You're hurting Robert, who's arrogant but doesn't deserve to have his career sabotaged. You're hurting me, because I'm trying to build a professional reputation, and now I'm associated with systems that don't work." The criticism was delivered without anger or accusation, which somehow made it more devastating than if Lisa had been shouting. Sarah was being called to account by someone who understood her motivations, but couldn't excuse her methods. "Most importantly," Lisa continued, "you're hurting the clients whose businesses depend on these systems working correctly. Small business owners who trust Pinnacle to handle their financial data accurately. People whose livelihoods could be destroyed if their accounting software fails during tax season or payroll processing." Sarah had been trying not to think about the end users, the small business owners and their employees who depended on Pinnacle's systems, without understanding the corporate politics that had led to their software being deliberately compromised. Lisa's analysis forced her to confront the human cost of her revenge. "What do you want from this conversation?" Sarah asked. Lisa closed her folder and leaned forward, her expression serious but not hostile. "I want you to stop. Not because I think you don't have legitimate grievances, but because you're destroying innocent people to get back at someone who doesn't even understand what he's losing. The damage is already done. The systems are already compromised." "Some of the damage is done," Lisa corrected. "But Marcus and Robert are still implementing new features based on your flawed training. More clients are going to be affected if this continues. And eventually, when the scope of the problems becomes clear, there's going to be an investigation that traces everything back to you." Sarah had been trying not to think about the legal implications of her sabotage. Deliberately introducing security vulnerabilities into financial software could be considered a federal crime, especially if client data was compromised as a result. "What are you proposing?" "Come clean. Admit what you've done, provide correct training materials, and help us rebuild the systems properly. Take responsibility for the damage you've caused and try to minimize future harm." It was exactly what Sarah knew she should do. But the prospect of facing the full consequences of her actions, termination, legal exposure, professional reputation destroyed, felt overwhelming. "And if I don't?" Lisa's expression remained steady. "Then I'll document everything and present it to Jennifer and David. I'll recommend that all code developed based on your training be scrapped and rebuilt from scratch. And I'll suggest that they investigate whether your actions constitute deliberate sabotage that requires legal action." The ultimatum was delivered without threat or anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd thought through all the implications and reached a firm decision. "How long do I have?" 24 hours, long enough for you to make the right choice voluntarily, but not long enough for more damage to be done." Lisa stood and gathered her materials, but paused. At the door. "Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you're a brilliant architect. The systems you actually built for Pinnacle are elegant and robust. Under different circumstances, I would have been honored to learn from you." After Lisa left, Sarah sat alone in her office as the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made Boulder look like a postcard from a more innocent world. The city lights began twinkling to life, startup founders working late in converted warehouses, software engineers debugging code in glass-walled offices, venture capitalists calculating returns on the next generation of technological disruption. She thought about Lisa's father, driving delivery trucks after 28 years of building quality control systems. She thought about Marcus apologizing for failing to implement her deliberately flawed teachings correctly. She thought about Amy's question about what kind of person she wanted to be when this was over. Sarah opened her laptop and began drafting an email to Jennifer and David. The subject line read, "Regarding the training program issues, full disclosure." As she typed, she could hear Amy's voice asking whether she wanted to prove she was better than the way David had treated her, or just prove she could be as bad as him. The answer, finally, was clear. But as her fingers moved across the keyboard, Sarah realized that choosing to do the right thing didn't erase the consequences of having done the wrong thing for so long. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, professional consequences, and the hard work of rebuilding trust that she'd deliberately destroyed. The only question now was whether it was too late to salvage something meaningful from the wreckage of her revenge. Sarah's feet carried her through Boulder's empty streets without conscious direction, her mind churning through Lisa's ultimatum like a processor stuck in an infinite loop. The October air was sharp with the promise of winter, and the familiar scent of wood smoke from the houses nestled against the foothills mixed with the sterile smell of fear-induced sweat that seemed to cling to her clothes. It was past midnight when she found herself standing outside Frank Rodriguez's small house in the Mapleton Hill neighborhood, staring at the warm light spilling from his kitchen window. Frank had always been the person she turned to when technical problems felt unsolvable, but this wasn't a technical problem. It was a moral one, and Sarah wasn't sure her oldest friend at Pinnacle would have any patience for what she'd done. She was turning to leave when the front door opened. "Sarah?" Frank stood silhouetted in the doorway, wearing an old Air Force t-shirt and pajama pants. "What are you doing out here?" "I was walking and ended up here somehow. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Get inside before you freeze to death." Frank stepped aside, gesturing her into the warmth of his living room. "Coffee, or something stronger?" "Coffee would be good." Frank's kitchen was exactly what Sarah expected from a former military man living alone, meticulously organized, spotlessly clean, and stocked with the kind of practical items that suggested someone who valued function over form. He moved with the efficient precision she remembered from their years working together, preparing coffee with the same methodical approach he brought to debugging network problems. "You look like hell," he said without preamble, setting a steaming mug in front of her. "I feel like hell." Frank settled into the chair across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around his own coffee. At 50, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen enough of the world to understand that most problems had solutions, even if those solutions were painful. "This is about the training program, isn't it?" Sarah stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise like smoke from a funeral pyre. "How much do you know?" "I know Marcus came to me yesterday asking questions about database optimization patterns. I know Lisa's been staying late to research industry best practices. I know Robert's been panicking about performance issues that shouldn't exist if the training materials were correct." Frank paused, his expression thoughtful. "And I know you well enough to recognize when you're carrying the weight of something you can't talk about." Sarah felt the last of her defenses crumble. "I sabotaged the training, Frank. Everything I taught them was deliberately wrong." The confession hung between them like a physical thing. Frank's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see him, processing the implications with the same systematic approach he brought to complex technical problems. Why? Sarah found herself explaining everything. The humiliation of the demotion disguised as promotion, the requirement to train her cheaper, replacements, the casual cruelty of David Thornton's corporate speak dismissal of 15 years of expertise. Frank listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of what he was thinking. "So, you decided to make them fail," he said when she finished. "I decided to make David Thornton learn what happens when you throw away institutional knowledge. But David Thornton isn't the one who's suffering, is he?" The question cut to the heart of what Lisa had been trying to tell her. David Thornton didn't understand the technical details well enough to be personally affected by system failures. He would weather this crisis the way executives always did, by firing people and hiring consultants to clean up the mess. "No," Sarah admitted, "he's not." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring out his kitchen window at the sleeping city below. "You know what I learned in the Air Force about revenge?" Sarah waited. "That it's like flying a plane with a damaged navigation system. You think you're heading toward your target, but usually you just end up crashing into something you never meant to hit." The metaphor was characteristically frank, practical, precise, and devastating in its accuracy. "What should I do?" "What do you think you should do?" Sarah thought about Marcus's earnest questions and genuine respect. She thought about Lisa's careful analysis and measured ultimatum. She thought about Robert's overconfidence and the way it had made him an easy target for manipulation. Most of all, she thought about Amy's question about what kind of person she wanted to be when this was over. "I should confess. Fix what I can. Face the consequences." Frank nodded slowly. "That sounds like the Sarah Mitchell I've known for 12 years. What if it's too late? What if the damage can't be repaired?" "Then you deal with that too. But you deal with it as someone who tried to make things right, not as someone who kept making them worse." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. "Amy. Mom, are you okay? Your car's not here and it's really late." "I should go home," Sarah said. "Amy's worried." Frank walked her to the door. "Sarah, for what it's worth, I understand why you did it. David Thornton's approach to people is problematic, but understanding why you did something doesn't make it right." "I know." "And Sarah, whatever happens with the company, whatever legal consequences you might face, you're still one of the best architects I've ever worked with. Don't let this define everything you've built." The drive home through Boulder's empty streets gave Sarah time to think about Frank's words. When she pulled into her driveway, Amy was waiting in the kitchen, still dressed despite the late hour. "Mom? What's wrong?" Sarah sat down across from her daughter, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "I need to tell you something about what I've been doing at work." Amy listened without interruption as Sarah explained the sabotage, the growing consequences, and Lisa's ultimatum. When Sarah finished, Amy was quiet for a long moment. "Are you going to confess?" "Yes, tomorrow morning." Amy nodded, as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "Good. I was worried you were going to keep going until someone got really hurt." "Someone already got really hurt. Several someones." "But you're going to try to fix it now?" "I'm going to try." Amy reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I'm proud of you." The simple statement hit Sarah harder than any criticism or ultimatum. "Even though I screwed up everything?" "Especially because you screwed up everything and you're still going to try to make it right. That's harder than just doing the right thing from the beginning." Sarah spent the rest of the night drafting and redrafting her confession email, trying to find words that would adequately express the scope of her sabotage and her commitment to repairing the damage. By dawn, she had settled on a simple, direct message that laid out the facts without excuses or justifications. At 7 a.m., she called Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, her former mentor from the University of Colorado who had guided her through night school, while she was raising Amy as a single mother. Beth had always been the person Sarah turned to when she needed perspective on difficult decisions. "Sarah, what a lovely surprise. How are things at Pinnacle?" "Complicated. Beth, I need some advice about a situation I've gotten myself into." Sarah explained the sabotage and its consequences, ending with her plan to confess that morning. Beth listened with the patient attention that had made her such an effective teacher. "What do you hope to accomplish with this confession?" Beth asked when Sarah finished. "I want to minimize the damage to innocent people. I want to take responsibility for what I've done, and I want to prove to myself that I'm better than what I became." "Those are good reasons. What are you afraid of?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I'm afraid of losing everything. My career, my reputation, my financial security. I'm afraid of not being able to provide for Amy. I'm afraid of being remembered as the architect who sabotaged her own systems instead of the one who built something lasting. And if all of those fears come true, then I'll deal with them. But I'll deal with them knowing I tried to do the right thing in the end." Beth was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, do you remember what I told you the night before your senior project presentation?" Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. "That the measure of an engineer isn't whether they build perfect systems, but whether they take responsibility for the systems they do build. I think you're about to remember what that really means." At 8:30 a.m., Sarah walked into Pinnacle Systems for what might be the last time as an employee. The building looked the same, glass and steel reaching toward the Colorado sky, filled with the ambitious energy of people building the future one line of code at a time. But Sarah felt like a different person than the one who had started this sabotage weeks ago. She found Jennifer in her office, surrounded by crisis management documents and looking like she hadn't slept well in days. "Sarah, I thought you weren't coming in until the afternoon meeting. I need to talk to you and David about the training program, about everything." Jennifer's expression shifted from tired confusion to alert concern. "What kind of everything?" "The kind that requires me to take full responsibility for problems I created." 20 minutes later, Sarah sat in the same conference room where this had all started, facing David Thornton and Jennifer Walsh with a printed copy of her confession and a comprehensive plan for repairing the damage she had caused. "Before we begin," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do, "I want you to know that I take full responsibility for everything I'm about to tell you. The decisions were mine, the consequences are mine, and the obligation to fix this is mine." David leaned back in his chair, his expression calculating. "This sounds like it's going to be an expensive conversation." "Yes," Sarah said simply. "It is." And then she began to tell them exactly how expensive it was going to be. The conference room fell into the kind of silence that follows devastating admissions, broken only by the distant hum of Boulder's morning traffic and the faint click of David Thornton's pen as he processed the full scope of Sarah's confession. Jennifer sat frozen in her chair, her coffee growing cold as she stared at the comprehensive document Sarah had placed before them. 23 pages detailing every deliberate flaw in the training program, every sabotaged system, and every client potentially affected by her actions. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," David said finally, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone calculating legal exposure. "You deliberately taught our replacement developers incorrect methodologies, knowing that this would result in system failures and security vulnerabilities." "Yes. You introduced these flaws into systems that handle financial data for dozens of small businesses." "Yes. And you did this as an act of revenge against the company's decision to restructure your position." Sarah met his gaze directly. "Yes." David set down his pen with deliberate precision. "Sarah, Do you understand that what you've described could constitute criminal sabotage? That we could be looking at federal charges related to deliberately compromising financial systems? I understand. That's why I'm here, to take responsibility and minimize further damage. Jennifer finally found her voice, though it came out strained and disbelieving. Sarah, I've known you for 15 years. I've watched you work nights and weekends to make sure our systems never failed. How could you deliberately sabotage the same systems you spent your career protecting? The question cut deeper than any legal threat. Sarah could see the personal betrayal in Jennifer's eyes. Not just the professional consequences, but the realization that someone she'd trusted and respected had been systematically lying to her for weeks. Because I was angry, Sarah said simply, and I lost sight of who I was supposed to be. David was already reaching for his phone. I need to call legal, and probably the FBI's cybercrime unit. Wait. Sarah held up her hand. Before you make those calls, I want you to understand what I'm proposing to fix this. She opened her laptop and projected a detailed remediation plan she'd spent the previous night preparing. Every system built using my sabotage training can be identified and corrected. I've documented the specific flaws and provided correct implementations for each problematic pattern. The security vulnerabilities can be patched within 48 hours if we act immediately. David studied the projection with the focused attention of someone calculating damage control costs. How long will it take to rebuild everything properly? 6 weeks for the critical systems, 3 months for complete remediation, and I'll do all of it without compensation while you determine what other consequences I should face. You'll do it from prison if the FBI decides this constitutes federal computer crime. Sarah nodded. If necessary. But the client's data will be secure regardless of what happens to me personally. Jennifer was scrolling through the remediation plan on her tablet, her expression cycling between professional assessment and personal hurt. This is incredibly detailed. You've thought through every aspect of fixing what you broke. I've had time to think about the consequences of my choices. A knock at the conference room door interrupted the tense conversation. Marcus, Lisa, and Robert stood outside, their expressions suggesting they'd been summoned rather than volunteering to attend. Come in, David said curtly. Sarah has something she needs to tell you about your training program. The 3 developers filed into the room, settling into chairs with the cautious energy of people who sensed they were walking into a situation they didn't fully understand. Sarah looked at each of them. Marcus with his earnest respect and genuine talent, Lisa with her perceptive analysis and moral courage, Robert with his overconfidence that had made him an easy target for manipulation. I need to apologize to all of you, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. And I need to explain why the systems you've been building have been failing. She walked through the same confession she'd given David and Jennifer, watching their faces as they processed the revelation that their training had been deliberately sabotaged. Marcus went pale, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching devastation. Robert's mouth fell open in obvious shock. Lisa nodded slightly, as if Sarah's admission confirmed suspicions she'd been harboring. All this time, Marcus said quietly, when I was questioning my own abilities, when I was apologizing for not implementing your teachings correctly. His voice trailed off as the full implications hit him. You were implementing them correctly, Sarah said. I taught you wrong on purpose. Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Do you have any idea what this has done to my confidence? To my professional reputation? I've been telling people about the innovative approaches. I learned from the legendary Sarah Mitchell, and now I find out they were all deliberately flawed? Robert, no. His voice was sharp with anger and humiliation. You used my eagerness to learn against me. You made me look incompetent to cover up your own revenge plot. Lisa spoke for the first time since entering the room. What about the clients? How many businesses are running compromised systems because of this? The question refocused the room's attention on the broader consequences. Sarah pulled up another section of her remediation plan. 14 client implementations are affected. 3 have experienced significant system failures. All of them have security vulnerabilities that need immediate patching. David was taking notes with the grim efficiency of someone preparing for damage control meetings with lawyers and insurance companies. What's our legal exposure here? Potentially significant, Sarah admitted. GDPR violations for the clients with European operations, SOX compliance issues for the publicly traded clients, and possible liability for any business disruption caused by system failures. Jennifer set down her tablet with visible frustration. Sarah, I have to ask, did it ever occur to you that your revenge would hurt innocent people? That small business owners would suffer because their financial software didn't work correctly? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah thought about Amy's pointed questions about who would really be hurt by the sabotage, about Frank's metaphor of revenge being like flying with damaged navigation. It occurred to me, Sarah said quietly, but I convinced myself that the greater good was served by exposing the consequences of throwing away institutional knowledge. I was wrong. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice carrying a pain that cut deeper than any professional criticism. I trusted you. I looked up to you. I defended your teaching methods even when they seemed questionable because I respected your experience. I know, and I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that I spent weeks implementing security vulnerabilities because someone I trusted told me they were best practices. Lisa opened her tablet and began taking notes. What's the immediate action plan? How do we minimize damage to the affected clients? Her practical focus on problem-solving rather than recrimination reminded Sarah why she'd found Lisa's analytical approach both impressive and threatening during the training program. First, we need to identify and patch all security vulnerabilities within 48 hours, Sarah said, grateful for the opportunity to focus on solutions rather than consequences. Second, we need to rebuild the compromised systems using correct architectural patterns. Third, we need to notify affected clients about the issues and our remediation timeline. David was already reaching for his phone again. I need to brief the board about potential legal exposure. Jennifer, schedule emergency meetings with all affected clients, and someone needs to call our cyber insurance carrier. As the immediate crisis management began, Sarah found herself in the strange position of being both the cause of the emergency and the primary resource for addressing it. Her expertise was still needed, perhaps more than ever, but now it came with the weight of her betrayal attached. Marcus packed up his laptop with sharp, efficient movements. I'll be working from home while I process this. I need some time to figure out how to rebuild my confidence in systems I can't trust. Robert stood to leave as well, his earlier anger having settled into cold professionalism. I'll be updating my LinkedIn profile and portfolio. I need to distance myself from any association with compromised systems. Lisa remained seated, still taking notes. Sarah, I'll need detailed documentation of every flawed pattern so I can audit our entire codebase. And I want to understand your actual architectural approaches, the ones you use when you're not sabotaging people. The offer of continued professional collaboration despite everything that had happened was unexpected and painful in its generosity. Lisa, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Because regardless of what you did or why you did it, we still have systems to fix and clients to protect. Personal feelings don't change technical requirements. As the meeting dispersed and people filed out to begin the complex work of damage control, Sarah found herself alone with Jennifer in the conference room that had witnessed both the beginning and the potential end of her career at Pinnacle. What happens now? Sarah asked. Jennifer was staring out the window at the Flatirons, their red sandstone faces unchanged by the human drama playing out in the conference room below. Now we find out if 15 years of professional reputation can survive a few weeks of spectacular professional sabotage. And if it can't, then you'll have learned something important about the difference between building systems and destroying them. Sarah gathered her materials, knowing that the hardest part wasn't the confession she'd just made, but the months of rebuilding trust in systems that lay ahead. The question was whether she'd have the opportunity to do that rebuilding from inside, Pinnacle Systems, or whether her expertise would be applied from whatever came after her career imploded completely. Outside the conference room windows, Boulder continued its relentless pursuit of the future. Startup founders and software engineers building the next generation of systems that would either serve their users well or fail them catastrophically. Sarah had spent her career on the building side of that equation. Now she was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side, cleaning up the wreckage of her own choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.